On the night of the banquet, my daughter looked at my feet, curled her lip, and whispered loud enough for others to hear, "Don't walk beside me in those old shoes. You'll embarrass us." The words landed harder than any slap, not because of leather or cracks, but because they came from blood, from the very mouth I had once fed with bread bought by the hours I carved out of my own body. The shoes had been faithful longer than most people I knew. Their leather was cracked like dry earth after too many summers, their soles thin enough that the cold of the ground sometimes seeped into my bones. Each scar, each crease carried a story. Nights walking home after double shifts at the factory, mornings climbing ladders to fix the roofs of others' houses, afternoons pacing hospital corridors while waiting for news that never came. Cheap. They were not just shoes. They were a ledger of my life, written in wear and silence. But to them, to my children, to the glittering crowd I was about to face, they were nothing more than proof of failure. Proof that I hadn't moved on with the times, that I hadn't traded sweat for shine, or sacrifice for show. To them, they screamed irrelevance. I bent down briefly in the quiet of my small kitchen before leaving, running a cloth over the surface, trying to soften the scuffs, polish the years away. The effort was pitiful, but I wasn't polishing for vanity. I was polishing for dignity. And yet I knew even before stepping into the hall that no rag, no spit, no stubbornness could erase what life had carved into that leather. Walking through the streets that night, the shoes carried me like they always had. They did not complain, did not buckle, but I carried something heavier than weight. The sound of my daughter's words, the memory of her eyes flicking to the floor in shame when I entered, and the truth that for her, love was conditional now, measured in appearances, in polish, in how much laughter others could suppress when they saw me. Still, I walked on. Because the shoes didn't care about smirks, and deep down, neither did I. What I cared about was the silence at the end of those smirks, when time itself would speak louder than polished leather. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. Write in the comments. Where are you listening from? Has something like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, let's continue. The hall shimmered, as though it had been built not for celebration, but for judgment. Chandeliers spilled golden light across polished marble, and the air was thick with perfumes and the sound of laughter rehearsed to perfection. Shoes clicked on the floor like instruments in an orchestra of pride. Black leather, shining heels, every step announcing wealth, comfort, belonging. My own steps made no sound, absorbed into the cracks of worn soles, swallowed by the silence of age and use. I entered quietly, shoulders slightly bent, not from defeat, but from years of carrying burdens no one here had ever dared to touch. Yet in a place like this, silence did not hide you. It exposed you. Eyes traveled downward before they met my face. The glittering crowd never searched for hearts first. They searched for weaknesses. A crease in a jacket, a loosened seam, a wrinkle too deep. And when their gaze landed on my feet, they did not even bother to disguise their discovery. Smiles curved like blades, thin and sharp, cutting without sound. Their glances brushed over me as if I were less a man and more a shadow that had stumbled into their light. I found a seat at the edge of the room, where the light dimmed just enough to allow a moment of breath. But even there, whispers carried. The laughter did not always name me, but it always pointed toward me. My shoes, those old companions of my life's hardest years, became the centerpiece of mockery without a single word spoken aloud. Every time I lifted my head, I caught the glance of someone turning away too late, smirking into their glass, hiding behind a napkin, or exchanging silent nods with their neighbor. Betrayal wears many faces, but none so cruel as the face that pretends not to see you while laughing at you all the same. The hall itself felt like a test, and every polished surface reflected my absence. I saw myself not as I was, but as they wanted me to appear, outdated, forgotten, irrelevant. The air pressed down heavier than stone, yet I kept my chest steady, my hands calm. There is a kind of strength in silence, a kind they mistook for weakness. They believed that if they ignored me long enough, I would shrink into the cracks of the marble floor, that my story would dissolve into nothingness under the weight of their indifference. But the truth was simpler. I had already survived storms fiercer than their judgment, and though the hall glittered with pride and vanity, its brightness only made their emptiness more visible. My shoes, cracked and worn, carried more history in their scars than all the polished leather in that room combined. And as I sat there, surrounded by shallow laughter and sharpened smiles, I knew justice, though delayed, always finds its entrance. It didn't take long. Their eyes fell, as if drawn by some invisible thread, to the floor beneath me. Not to my face, not to the years that had carved themselves into the lines of my skin, not to the quiet dignity of endurance, but to the shoes, always the shoes. A whisper brushed the air, too soft to carry words, but loud enough to ignite a ripple. A chuckle followed, thin and sharp, echoing louder than the music. The sound spread like a stain, creeping from table to table, mouth to mouth. They did not need to speak aloud what they thought. The curve of their lips, the twitch of their eyebrows, the cruel sparkle in their eyes, spoke with more cruelty than any voice. You don't belong. The hall became a theater of smirks. Some were small, hidden behind the rim of a glass or the tilt of a fan. Others were bold, unashamed, stretching wide across powdered faces. They pretended to toast, to laugh at some clever remark. But I knew. I had lived long enough to know when laughter has no joy in it, when it carries only poison. It was not my name on their lips, but the shoes. Always the shoes. The cracked leather, the fading laces, the stubborn souls that had marched too far, carried too much, endured too long. I sat still as though carved from wood, but inside the silence roared. Every smirk was a betrayal, not just of me, but of what I had given. They had forgotten, or perhaps chosen never to remember, that these shoes had walked through storms for them, carried loads meant to crush, bought time they now wasted so easily. The banquet gleamed with wealth, yet I could not help but wonder how much of it had been built on backs like mine, how many glasses were raised because my hands once worked while theirs rested. One man leaned closer to his companion, the corners of his lips bent with amusement, his eyes flicking downward again. He didn't need to say it. The whole room already had. To them I was less than the marble they stood upon, an intruder dressed in weariness, an embarrassment wrapped in old leather. The smirks stung because they carried no truth, only vanity. And yet, the wound was real, because it came not from strangers, but from those who knew my name and chose to forget what it meant. I looked at the shoes beneath me. For a moment, shame pressed heavy on my chest, threatening to bend me lower. But then the memory rose. Nights walking home under rain, mornings arriving before sunrise, afternoons giving when there was nothing left to give. Those smirks could not erase those truths. Still, the air burned with their silent laughter, and the weight of it pressed harder than chains. I said nothing, because sometimes silence itself is the loudest answer. And while their smirks glimmered for now, I knew the glow of vanity always fades when truth steps into the room. I kept my back straight, my hands calm on the table, my face set in the mask of someone untouched, but inside the wound was raw and deep. It was not the shoes that cut me, it was what they stood for, what they silently carried into that glittering hall. Every crease, every tear in the leather was a reminder of where my money had gone, where my strength had been spent. Tuition for children who now looked away in shame, food that kept bellies full while mine often went empty, hospital bills paid with the weight of my hours, roofs repaired for others while my own leaked. Never once had I traded sweat for vanity, and yet, here I was, marked as lesser because I had chosen to give rather than to shine. The sting was not humiliation, it was betrayal. I had thought sacrifice was a language everyone could understand, a story written not in ink but in deeds. But in this room, in this hall of polish and pride, sacrifice was invisible. They did not see the father who had walked through nights with worn soles so his children could arrive to school in new shoes. They did not see the man who had worked until his hands bled so that others could live with ease. They only saw leather worn thin, laces frayed, and they mistook it for weakness. My chest tightened, not with anger but with a kind of sorrow no one could read on my face. It was the sorrow of realizing that those you love most sometimes forget the price you paid for them to smile. The laughter around me grew louder, but I sat still, gripping the silence as though it were a shield. For if I allowed myself to speak, if I allowed my heart to crack open, the wound would bleed too openly, and I would not give them that pleasure. I stared at the shoes beneath me. To them they were nothing more than evidence of poverty. To me, they were monuments. They had carried the weight of groceries when the cupboards were bare. They had stepped into places of rejection and still walked out with dignity intact. They had paced hospital floors when I prayed silently for life to stay a little longer. They had walked to jobs where respect was scarce, but necessity was plenty. These shoes were the reason they sat now in comfort, but not one of them saw it. The smirks cut me, yes, but deeper still was the silence of gratitude that never came. That silence was the true wound, sharper than mockery. And as I sat beneath the glow of chandeliers, surrounded by laughter that mistook itself for triumph, I held on to one truth. Wounds can be ignored, but they do not vanish. They wait, they deepen, and someday they demand to be seen. It came like a stone thrown into still water, sudden, sharp, and rippling through the hall before anyone could pretend not to notice. A voice, casual but cruel, slipped through the murmur of conversation. "Old shoes," it said, not in kindness, not even in jest, but with the venom of mock pity. The words floated just high enough to be caught by eager ears, and then the dam broke. Laughter rose like smoke, thick and suffocating, curling into every corner of the room. It was not laughter of joy, but of permission, permission to wound, permission to join together in a chorus of betrayal dressed up as amusement. The chandeliers glittered above, catching on glasses lifted half in toast, half in mockery. Faces turned toward me, not with questions or curiosity, but with certainty. The certainty that I was unworthy, the certainty that I was out of place. Each chuckle was another verdict, each smirk another nail. I had entered a hall of mirrors, but every reflection was twisted, showing not the man who had built, carried, endured, but only the leather on his feet, worn thin by years of sacrifice. The sting pierced deeper, because it was not strangers who laughed. Some of these voices belonged to those who had once eaten bread from my table, who had once borrowed strength from my hands, who had once called me a friend, a father, a guide. Now they turned their heads and let their lips curl into cruel shapes, because it was easier to laugh with the crowd than to stand in silence with me. I sat motionless, the laughter crashing against me like waves. Inside, my chest ached, not from shame, but from the weight of memory. Did they not know these shoes had walked through winters so they could sit by fires? Did they not remember the nights I worked while they slept, the mornings I rose while they lingered in warmth? I had traded my youth for their comfort, my pride for their future, and here, in this room, that trade was reduced to a joke. The words "old shoes" echoed longer than they should have, because they carried more than ridicule. They carried rejection. They marked me as uninvited, as an intruder in a hall I had once helped fill with life. My throat tightened, but I said nothing. Words would have been too small against the tide of their betrayal. Silence was my last defense, though even silence trembled under the weight of their laughter. Still, I did not lower my gaze. I let them laugh, let them smirk, let them take their fill. Because laughter that feeds on cruelty always runs dry. And one day when the truth enters the room, it will silence even the loudest mockery. The laughter faded into smaller pockets of conversation, but its echo clung to me like smoke that would not clear. I sat at the edge of the hall, a place no one had reserved for me, a chair that seemed colder than the marble floor beneath it. From there, every sound was amplified. The clink of glass, the scrape of cutlery, the burst of laughter from groups gathered in warm circles where I did not belong. Each note reminded me that I was a part, not simply by choice, but by their silent verdict. They had drawn the line, and I had been left on the wrong side of it. Isolation sharpens betrayal. If strangers had mocked me, the wound might have stung, but soon faded. But these were not strangers. Some of these men had eaten meals my hands had paid for. Some of these women had once brought their children to my home, trusting me when they had nowhere else to go. My own family was among them, faces turned slightly away, pretending not to hear what had been said, pretending not to notice me sitting alone. Their silence was louder than laughter. Their silence was consent. I looked around the hall, at the glittering chandeliers, the polished shoes, the shining fabric stretched tight across proud shoulders. All of it stood upon foundations that men like me had poured, walls we had raised, roofs we had secured. Yet here, in the place where my labor lived in every brick, I was treated as though I were no more than a shadow crossing the floor. My sacrifices had been the soil, but they were the flowers who now denied the ground existed. The seat I occupied felt smaller with every passing minute, not because of its size, but because of the distance it marked, the distance between what I had given and what they chose to remember. Loneliness wrapped around me like a cloak, but it was not the loneliness of being unseen, it was the loneliness of being erased. I folded my hands, steadied my breath, and fixed my gaze not on their smirks, but on the shoes at my feet. They told the story none of them wished to hear. They spoke of roads walked so others could rest, of burdens carried so others could lift glasses now in careless celebration. And though I sat apart, though every sound in that hall pressed heavier against my chest, I held on to one truth. Silence and betrayal do not have the final word. They may wound, they may isolate, but they cannot erase what has already been built. And so I remained in that lonely seat, enduring, waiting, not for their approval, not even for their shame, but for the moment when the weight of truth would finally take its place in the room. Beneath the table where no one's gaze dared to follow, my hand drifted to the cracked leather at my feet. My fingers traced the rough edges, the ridges worn into the shoes like scars on living skin. Each mark carried its own voice, its own story. I could feel the nights in them, nights when I walked home from double shifts, shoulders bent under exhaustion, but legs carrying me steady because someone at home needed the envelope of money tucked in my pocket. Those souls had soaked up rain and snow and sweat, had pounded pavements when my body wanted to collapse, had whispered in their own language, "One more step, one more day, don't stop yet." I could feel the mornings, too, carved into the stitches that had held longer than they should. Mornings when the sun rose over broken fences and leaking roofs, and it was my hands that fixed them, not for myself, not even for thanks, but because no child deserved to sleep beneath a sky that rained on them indoors. The shoes had gripped ladders, balanced on beams, climbed where fear might have stopped another man. They bore the weight not only of my body, but of responsibilities that were never mine alone. And the afternoons, they lived in the frayed laces. Afternoons when my arms ached from carrying groceries I could barely afford, yet I carried them with quiet pride because they were not for me. Bags of bread, milk, fruit, medicine, all for those who never once asked how I managed to provide. The shoes knew the truth, that I gave up my hunger so theirs could be fed, that I went without so their tables could look full, that I carried more than food, I carried the illusion of security, so they might believe life was kinder than it truly was. Every crack, every stain, every worn thread, was a record of sacrifice. They were not shoes anymore, they were a journal, a testament written without ink. And under that grand table, surrounded by laughter and betrayal, I remembered what they could not erase, that I had given and given and given. Not for applause, not for recognition, but because it was the only way I knew to love. My chest ached as my thumb pressed deeper into the leather. I wondered if any of them would ever see it, if they would ever understand that the very thing they mocked was the evidence of why they sat in comfort tonight. Betrayal was sharp, yes, but memory was sharper, and mine was carved into every step those shoes had ever taken. I sat still, letting the weight of memory anchor me. They could laugh, they could smirk, they could look away, but they could not change what had already been done, what had already been built, what had already been endured. The shoes bore witness, and so did I. The banquet rolled on as though nothing had happened, as though the laughter at my expense had been nothing more than a passing gust of wind. Glasses clinked in endless rhythm, a hollow music of pride and self-congratulation. Silverware struck porcelain with the elegance of ritual, and the air swelled with boasts, tales of new houses, new cars, new ventures that dripped with the ease of those who had never truly known want. They carried themselves like kings and queens seated on borrowed thrones, crowns invisible yet heavier than truth itself. Their laughter spread in waves, loud and confident, as if joy could be proven by its volume. And I sat apart, not unseen but deliberately ignored, my presence treated like an inconvenience they wished away. Invisible, yet never entirely. Because invisibility requires silence, and though I said nothing, the shoes at my feet spoke for me. They screamed louder than my stillness. Every time someone's eyes brushed against them, the leather cracked beneath the glow of chandeliers, and I saw the quick flicker, the recognition they tried to smother, the truth they refused to confront. For they knew, deep down, that those shoes had walked roads they themselves would never survive. The banquet was heavy with vanity. I watched them raise their glasses to each other, drunk not on wine but on their own reflection. They wore their polished shoes like trophies, each shine a declaration of arrival, each step rehearsed for admiration. And yet, in their pursuit of grandeur, they did not notice how empty their triumphs sounded. Every boast was met with forced applause, every story with exaggerated laughter, until the entire room became a stage where everyone performed, but no one believed. I sat in silence, letting the noise wash over me, the way a storm beats against stone. My seat, distant and cold, became an anchor in the sea of vanity. I did not envy them. I pitied them. For what they called strength was nothing more than display. What they called victory, nothing more than glittering decay. They had mistaken shine for substance, polish for worth, and in doing so, they had revealed their deepest poverty. The shoes beneath me carried no gleam, no polish, but they carried weight. Real weight. They carried nights of hunger endured without complaint, mornings of labor accepted without applause, afternoons of sacrifice made without witness. They carried the truth that love is proven not in words, not in boasts, not in laughter echoing across banquet halls, but in the quiet endurance of a man who gives until there is nothing left to give. As the feast carried on, I sat alone, surrounded by music and chatter that no longer stung but rang hollow. Their vanity filled the room, but my silence filled me. And in that silence I felt a power they could not name, a truth they could not smirk away. For a moment I thought of leaving. The chair beneath me felt harder with every passing second, the walls of the hall pressing closer, the noise swelling until it became unbearable. My shoes, once steady companions, felt like weights chained to my feet, iron dragging me deeper into shame. I imagined myself rising, walking out beneath the gaze of their smirks, their laughter following me down the steps, out into the night air where at least the sky did not judge. The thought tempted me: escape, silence, the relief of distance. To slip away before the wound grew deeper. To let them keep their banquet, their vanity, their hollow victories. But I did not move. Something inside me, stubborn, unbroken, older than the shoes themselves, held me in place. Not because I sought their approval, not because I wished for their kindness, but because I knew that truth has its own hour. Time is the only guest who never misses the banquet, and when it arrives, it speaks louder than laughter, stronger than scorn. I stayed, not out of weakness, but out of a quiet certainty that storms always break, and when they do, the air clears for what must be seen. The pain was uninvited, but it settled in my chest all the same, heavier than any burden I had carried before. It was not the pain of ridicule. That was small compared to the pain of recognition. Recognition that those I had sacrificed for, those who had once been cradled by the labor of these very hands, could now dismiss me with a smirk, erase me with a glance at my feet. That betrayal dug deeper than any wound my body had ever endured. And yet, even in that pain, I felt something stir, a refusal to let their blindness define me. I stared at the table before me, its polished wood gleaming beneath the lights. Plates overflowed with food, glasses with wine, but all I could see reflected in its surface was my own stillness. The shoes beneath me pressed into the ground, as though reminding me they had not carried me this far to leave in defeat. They had borne storms, miles, endless nights. They could bear this too, and so could I. I stayed, though every instinct begged me to rise and vanish. I stayed, though every laugh cut deeper into my skin. I stayed, because sometimes justice does not need to be chased. It needs to be witnessed, and I would be here when it came, no matter how long it took. The door swung open with a force that did not rattle, but commanded. A hush followed, unspoken but immediate, as if the air itself recognized the shift before the people did. The banker stepped inside, not hurried, not careless, but deliberate, each stride firm, steady, belonging to someone who knew both his worth and the weight of the room he entered. His eyes did not scatter across the banquet in shallow greetings the way the others had. No, his gaze searched with purpose, cutting past the chandeliers, past the polished laughter, past the glittering vanity that still lingered weakly in the air. The echo of their laughter died in their throats, half-finished smiles collapsing into uneasy silence. It was as though the very floor had grown ashamed of carrying their mockery. Every glass seemed suddenly too loud when set back on the table, every cough too sharp in the stillness. And then his eyes found me. The weight of the hall turned. I felt it, as surely as if the walls themselves had shifted. He did not glance at my shoes with disdain as the others had. He did not let his eyes crawl with pity or pride. Instead, his gaze held something I had not seen all evening: recognition. His face softened, not with the condescension of charity, but with the reverence of memory. In that single look, the balance of the room faltered, as if all the laughter, all the whispers, all the smirks had been built on sand and were now crumbling. The banker walked forward, his steps breaking the fragile silence that trailed behind him like glass shards. I could see the unease ripple through the hall, the way shoulders straightened, the way eyes darted between him and me, the way those who had laughed the loudest shifted in their seats as though caught in a lie. His presence did not shout, yet it thundered louder than anything spoken that night. I remained in my seat, unmoving, though my heart pounded against the silence that had wrapped itself around me for so long. For the first time that night, I felt the weight in my chest lift, not entirely, but enough to breathe without the taste of betrayal choking me. Because the door had not only opened, it had broken the spell of their vanity. And though no words had yet been spoken, I knew. The moment of truth had finally stepped into the room. His gaze landed on me, steady, unshaken, cutting through the shallow glitter of the hall. He did not glance at the polished shoes lined like trophies around the tables, nor at the silk ties knotted tight to choke out sincerity, nor at the diamond watches raised in empty toasts. His eyes passed over all of that without pause, and came straight to me, the one they mocked, the one they dismissed, the one they thought invisible. And in that moment, the silence of the hall deepened, as though the very air wanted to listen. A smile spread across his face, but it was not pity. It was not the smile of a man offering alms to the poor, or of one amused by some unexpected relic of the past. No, it was the smile of recognition, of honor. It was the expression of a man who remembered. His eyes did not see cracked leather. They saw the miles those shoes had carried, the storms they had endured, the burdens they had borne. He looked at me not as an embarrassment, but as a pillar. Worn, yes, but unbroken, and stronger for every scar. Around us the halls stiffened. I felt the unease ripple through them, like a current snapping across still water. Those who had laughed shifted in their seats, glances darting from him to me, unsure, caught in the trap of their own mockery. The smiles they had worn so easily now looked forced, brittle, already crumbling. The same mouths that had smirked and whispered now pressed shut, fearful of being heard. Their laughter, so loud only moments before, dissolved into a silence heavy with shame. But I did not move. I did not lower my eyes or rise to meet him. I sat as I had before, silent, steady, anchored in the lonely chair that had borne the weight of their betrayal. The only difference now was that I was no longer alone. His recognition filled the space like a light spreading into corners where shadows had lived too long. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was enough. That smile, that look, carried more justice than any accusation. For in one instant, without a word, the truth stood taller than their vanity, louder than their ridicule. They had tried to erase me with their smirks, but in his gaze I returned, not as a joke, not as a shadow, but as a man whose sacrifices could no longer be hidden beneath laughter. And though I had spoken no words that night, his eyes said them for me. I see you. I remember. I honor you. He spoke, and his words fell into the room like a bell tolling in a cathedral. Low, resonant, undeniable. There you are. I was hoping you'd be here. His voice carried no arrogance, no ceremony, only warmth and gratitude, the kind that needs no decoration because it comes from truth. The sound of it struck harder than the mockery that had echoed minutes before, for it was not laughter, it was reverence. And reverence has a way of silencing every shallow voice. He turned then, not just toward me, but toward the hall itself, toward the polished shoes and silk ties and diamond watches that had tried to drown me in their glitter. Do you know what this man did for me, for my family, for this town? His words did not ask, they commanded. They peeled back the walls of vanity with the sharpness of memory. Silence fell, heavy and merciless. It was not the comfortable quiet of contentment, but the suffocating hush of shame. Every smirk vanished, every whisper dried on the tongue. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Glasses hung suspended in air. They had been so quick to laugh, so eager to scorn, but now not one dared to breathe too loudly. For truth, once spoken, strips the room bare. My chest tightened, not with pride, but with the sting of long-buried recognition. His words did not erase the pain of betrayal, but they cut through it like light breaking into a cavern. And as his voice filled the hall, I saw their faces, faces that had turned away from me, faces that had smirked and chuckled, now paling under the weight of a story they could no longer ignore. I did not move, did not nod, did not answer. I simply sat, as I had all evening, silent and steady. But inside, something shifted. For in that moment, I was no longer the man with the old shoes. I was the man whose sacrifices had built the very comfort they reclined in. I was the man whose name could not be erased by laughter. And though the hall was filled with people, it was he and I who carried the air between us. His words had cut deeper than mockery ever could, not to wound but to reveal. And once revealed, the truth cannot be smirked away. The banker's voice did not tremble, nor did it rush. It carried the weight of memory, steady and unshakable, as though each word had been waiting years for this very moment. He began not with figures, not with titles, but with a story, his own, and mine woven into it. He told them of a storm long ago, when he was just a boy. The rain had beaten the earth into rivers, the wind tearing branches from trees, roofs from houses. His family was stranded, their small home breaking under the fury of the night, and he, a child, had been trapped, terrified, certain the dark would swallow him whole. "I remember," he said, his voice carrying into every corner of the hall, "how this man came through the storm. I remember his arms lifting me, carrying me against the rain, shielding me when he himself was soaked and shivering. I remember how he walked for miles through the flood with me in his arms, when he had no reason to, no debt to repay, only a heart that chose to." The silence deepened. The polished laughter of moments ago had no place now. Faces turned to me, but not with smirks. Their eyes searched for what they had mocked, and found instead the truth they had buried. The banker did not stop there. He told of days after the storm, when his family could not afford the repairs to their home, how I had come quietly, tools in hand, shoes already wearing the stains of labor, and fixed what the storm had broken. "He refused payment," the banker said, his voice thickening. "I remember my father pressing money into his hand, and I remember him pushing it back. He said only, 'One day, help someone else.' That was the price he set. Not for himself, for the world." The weight of those words settled like stone in the hall. Every face that had laughed at my shoes now stared at them differently. No longer as cracked leather, no longer as signs of shame, but as witnesses. Witnesses to storms weathered, burdens carried, love given without expectation of return. My throat tightened, but I did not speak. I let his words wash over the room, let them carve through the vanity like rivers through rock. For years I had carried these memories in silence, never expecting them to be spoken aloud. And now, here they were, revealed not by my voice, but by the man who had once been a child in my arms. Gratitude has a sound different from applause. It is quieter, heavier, more lasting. And in that hall I heard it, not from clapping hands, but from the stillness that followed his words. Stillness that admitted guilt, stillness that bowed to truth. I sat with my shoes planted firmly on the ground, and for the first time that night, the weight pressing on my chest began to lift. For what they had mocked was no longer leather, it was legacy. The smirks that had once carved through me so easily were gone, swept away as if the banker's words had stripped the room of its false courage. Faces that only moments ago gleamed with arrogance now looked pale under the light of the chandeliers. Their eyes, once sharp with judgment, no longer dared to rise above the table. They bent their heads, staring into plates that had already lost their taste, shifting in their seats as though the chairs themselves had grown too hard. Those who had laughed the loudest now wore the silence of guilt, their pride unraveling thread by thread. I did not need to speak. My shoes spoke for me, louder than any voice could. The very objects of their mockery had become a mirror, showing them what they had refused to see. These were not shoes of poverty. They were shoes of sacrifice. Every scar in the leather, every faded line in the sole, was a story of endurance. They had laughed at the evidence of my giving, at the cost of my love, at the proof of what I had carried when no one else would. And now, confronted with truth, they could not laugh any more. The banquet hall that had roared with vanity moments before now sat in uneasy stillness. The clinking of glasses ceased, the hollow boasts silenced. In their place was a weight heavier than stone, the weight of recognition. They saw what I had always known, that wealth is not measured in polish or shine, but in scars that prove survival, in sacrifices that build lives beyond your own. And suddenly, their polished shoes seemed shallow, their silk ties nothing more than decorations draped over empty pride. Some stole glances at me, as if to measure the depth of the wound they had inflicted, only to find no bitterness on my face, no plea for forgiveness. I remained as I was, quiet, steady, present. For I had no need to rise or defend myself. The truth had risen for me, and its voice was stronger than their laughter had ever been. Justice does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes softly, in the stillness after a storm, in the shame that creeps into the eyes of those who once mocked. That night, justice unfolded, not in words of anger, but in silence. Silence that crushed vanity, silence that revealed sacrifice, silence that restored what they had tried to take. And in that silence, I sat with my old shoes firmly on the ground, no longer heavy with shame, but carrying the quiet weight of victory. The banker did not remain at the edge of the hall. He crossed the floor with steady steps, every movement breaking the fragile pride that still clung to those who had mocked me. No one spoke. No one dared to laugh. No one even shifted in their seats. The sound of his shoes striking the marble was like a drumbeat, each step announcing that justice had entered the room in its simplest form, a man carrying gratitude that time had not erased. He came directly to me, not swayed by the glitter of jewels or the lure of titles, but guided by something stronger, memory, respect, truth. When he stopped, he did not look down on me. He did not offer a quick nod or a passing smile. He extended his hand, firm, deliberate, with the weight of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I lifted mine slowly, the silence of the hall pressing around us like a tide. And when our hands met, it was as though the years of betrayal cracked open and released a light no one could dim. His grip was strong, but what struck me more was the steadiness in his eyes. No pity, no performance, only honor. And then he spoke, his voice carrying to every corner, every ear that had once filled the room with mockery. Thank you. 2 words, nothing more. Yet they rang louder than the chandelier's glitter, louder than the laughter that had humiliated me, louder than any applause that might have followed. They were not words of charity. They were words of acknowledgement. A debt, long carried in silence, had now been repaid not with money, but with truth. The hall shifted. I felt it in the air, in the uneasy stir of those who looked down at their plates, in the trembling hands that lifted glasses only to set them down again untouched. Those who had smirked now swallowed hard, their vanity shrinking to nothing beneath the weight of 2 simple words. The shoes they had mocked were no longer jokes. They were monuments, symbols of endurance, of sacrifice, of a dignity that no insult could erase. I sat there, my old shoes planted firmly on the ground, and for the first time that night, the heaviness in my chest lifted. Not because they now understood, but because the truth had been spoken aloud. And once truth is spoken, it cannot be taken back. My dignity, stripped and trampled, had risen again, not in thunder, not in anger, but in the quiet strength of recognition. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in a handshake, in a word carried on the air like a seed that takes root in the heart. That night justice came not as vengeance, but as remembrance. My shoes, cracked and worn, had walked through storms, carried burdens, built futures. And now they stood as proof that the strongest paths are not always the polished ones, but the ones marked by scars, by sacrifice, by love given when no one applauded. I did not bow my head in shame, I bowed it in peace. The final bow was not mine alone, but the bow of truth, of dignity restored. And though the hall would forget its laughter, it would never forget that moment. For the night they tried to erase me, the truth returned, shook my hand, and spoke the words that echoed louder than any applause. Thank you.